Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode in the Run Breiter Podcast. I am your host, Sam Breiter, and I'm excited today that we have on another awesome guest. We have on Bishoy Tadros, who I've actually met through the tech world, believe it or not, but we have connected through a very similar passion. Believe it or not, it is running. And I've been following your journey for the last probably like 6 months now and hearing about your past experiences. And you've done some amazing things, both on the running side. You're an author, a speaker, so many other areas too. I mean, just such a versatile life. And I'm just really impressed by you. So I really wanted to bring you onto the show. But let me hand it off to you. First of all, how are you doing today?
Thanks, man. I really, really appreciate it. I was trying to think back. I don't know how we actually met. I know that we were connected on LinkedIn, and I remember we had a mutual friend, TJ Velarde. He commented on one of, I think, my posts, and he's like, "Hey, you two know each other?" Yeah. And I was just kind of like, "Yeah, I guess we do now." But yeah, no, it's awesome that, just kind of connecting over our professional lives in the tech space has brought us to really get to know each other on a more personal level through the sport of running, which I think, I think we both hold very near and dear to our heart.
Yeah. And I know we've had like some other conversations in the past, and you shared with me that it took you a little bit longer than other folks to get into running. Would love to hear like your story. We'll start from the beginning. Like,
sure.
What made you want to get into running?
Yeah, absolutely. So for context for the audience, I'm 38 years old, but I didn't run a race until I was 30. And so a lot has happened in the last 8 years. And to kind of summarize it, in the last 8 years, I've logged 14 marathons. I've run all 7 world majors. I went on to become the first Egyptian to run all 7 world majors. And if you had known the backstory behind all that, you would have never seen it coming. And I, quite frankly, never saw it coming myself. The backstory is that I was born in Egypt. When I was 3 years old, I was diagnosed with leukemia. It was the reason that my parents decided to immigrate. So they left everything that they knew in search of treatment, because this was back in 1990, and healthcare at the time in Egypt just wasn't up to par. It was essentially a life or death situation.
Yeah.
And they always thought they were going back. And I was young. I didn't really know what was going on at the time. And what happened was we moved to the States. I did a year of treatment in the City of Hope in California, and then moved to Long Island, where I finished treatment in the North Shore system, which is now Northwell. However, the treatment took longer than expected. There were a lot of setbacks. And when I was 13 years old, I had brain surgery to remove a golf ball sized mass from the right side of my brain over here. And so what they thought was going to be, not necessarily a quick trip, but, a trip that was going to end in the States and then go back home, ended up being a permanent move to New York at the time. And, for me, that story as a child, cancer is a really hard thing to explain to a kid as it's happening. And it's it's even harder to digest after it happens, because it's kind of like, whoa, like what just happened to my childhood? And the harder part of it for me wasn't so much the treatment, which undoubtedly was difficult. And in my first book, and the very first page, I take the readers to my feeling of a spinal tap and what that was like, and how vivid that memory is and how dark that is, especially as a 4-year-old. But believe it or not, it wasn't necessarily the treatment that was as scarring as it was the side effects of navigating that journey during that age, while also assimilating and figuring out life in a new place, because nothing was clicking on any cylinder, whether it was social, whether it was psychological, emotional, everything kind of felt broken at that time. And like a lot of other kids, I just wanted to play. And in particular, I just wanted to compete. I was a boy. I was out there. I was trying to play sports. I was obsessed with basketball. This was the 90s, the Jordan era. The Knicks were doing well, but, I'm a big Knicks fan now, but at the time I was a big Jordan fan. And, I remember shooting free throws in my backyard at night and, trying to be the first guy in the gym and the last guy out. But I'll never forget, and I talk about this most recently, was one of the things that really stood with me was the fact that coaches always told me I was too slow. And I never understood why. And back to what I was saying earlier, it's just really hard to explain cancer to a child. And, the chemotherapy and the radiation, they did a number on me. And as a result of that, I just couldn't keep up with the other kids. And no one was able to explain it to me at the time. But that messaging that I got from coaches every time I got cut from a team, or every time I was the last guy on the suicide lines, that really, really stuck with me. I'll take a pause there because there's more, but I just want to make sure that, I kind of give you that early piece of information just to kind of digest.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest, I'm sure, for both me and the viewer. And, the first word that comes to my mind is just how inspirational that story truly is. And I feel like with running, and hopefully this doesn't take away from your story, but it always seems like there's some emotional path to it. This is clearly quite the emotional story. And, I give you a lot of credit for handling all the adversity that you had growing up. I mean, I can't imagine how challenging it was for you to go through that. I mean, you said like cancer as a kid, hard to understand. It's hard to understand now, even like for me as an adult, when I see of other people dealing with what you dealt with. So yeah, thank you for opening up and sharing that. I think there's lots of people who can benefit from hearing that sort of story. And yeah, I mean, I can only imagine if you want to compete athletically, I mean, the recovery and the setbacks of going into any sort of fitness, you obviously had such a competitive disadvantage of what you dealt with. So yeah, I would love to continue hearing more about the story from there, but thank you.
So from there, like I mentioned, I had brain surgery, and that brain surgery happened to be on my 13th birthday. And one of the epiphanies that I had actually came about in one of my more darker moments, and that was in the recovery room. Because if anyone's familiar with the impact of having a brain surgery, especially a traumatic brain surgery, you're taped up from head to toe, and it hurts to breathe because your body is just so inflamed after coming out of that surgery, and your mind goes into some really dark places as you're recovering from that. And in the book, I talk about how I was in the pediatric ICU, and there was another child having a seizure at the time. And immediately you're in this fight or flight mode, and you start thinking to yourself, it's either him or me. We both can't make it here. That kind of lets you in on the darkness of that moment. But it was also within that darkness that, I'm trying to figure out, okay, where do I go from here? And I made a promise to myself, and it was anything that life puts in front of me at this point, I'm going to figure out a way to navigate. Like it literally cannot get any worse than this after everything that I had to navigate. And I came up with this mantra that I, had titled Break Barriers. And it was just like any barrier life puts in front of me, I'm going to figure out a way to knock down. But because you grow up fast under those circumstances, there's a certain level of maturity that comes with it. And you have to acknowledge what happened, and you have to learn from what happened. And through those experiences that I went through as a child, I built certain pillars that I realized I'd have to employ in order to succeed in anything I wanted to succeed in. For instance, I'm about to start high school, and I realized that so far I haven't really been able to make friends. But I did learn that, in order to make friends, I was probably going to have to cast a wide net. And I was probably going to have to get rejected by, a fair amount of people in order to find the right group for me. I had to really embrace the idea of perspective, the idea that, things happen for a reason, and that you're dealt your hand because you're built to play it. And, doubling down on the idea of rejection and going back to the feedback I consistently got in childhood about trying to compete, I told people that I went to a Friday night light school in Long Island. It was a big football school. And all I wanted to do, quite frankly, was just be a part of a locker room. I didn't even really care to get playing time. I had just never experienced being one of the guys. And this team never really cut anybody, but I got cut from it twice before I made it the third time. And I think it was that mindset of just continue to show up, just block out the noise, don't worry about the fact that, you didn't make it the first time. Don't worry about the fact that you didn't make it the second time. Just continue to show up. And, then when I finally made the team, I realized, okay, like this system can work. It might take time. You have to employ patience, but if you continue at it and continue chipping away, eventually you'll get the result that you want to get, in the long run. And, obviously this is a parallel that you can draw to the sport of running. But at that stage, I was really just testing out, does this formula work? If I'm patient, if I employ perspective, if I, lead with purpose, will that work? So, fast forward now, I went to college in upstate New York, SUNY Geneseo, for my undergrad. I graduated in the heart of the financial crisis, unemployed. I really wanted to work in banking, of course, in 2009, perfect time to want to work in banking. But being from Long Island, you were around a lot of Wall Street people, and it was just, the thing to do. And, I realized I had this edge through that lived experience that I had earlier and through that formula that I saw working as I tried to make friends and eventually made that team. And I said, if I could just outlast people during this dark era and continue showing up and putting one foot in front of the other and doing what I have to do to build my resume, I'll get there. And eventually I did. And then I landed my first, real job at JP Morgan after, a couple of years of navigating the turbulence of the financial crisis. But that's when it really started to kind of hit me. Like, I can rinse and repeat this formula in every part of my life, whether it's my professional life, my personal life, in sport, so on and so forth. And where the story goes from there is now I'm in my 20s. I'm living in New York City. I'm on Wall Street. Like a lot of people who work in the banking sector, I realized after a couple of years, it's not what I thought it was going to be. And, the allure wore off. And, I was always a purpose-driven individual, and I needed to feel like I was making an impact on something bigger than myself. And for years, I struggled to find out what that was going to be. And in my mid-20s, I finally found the right group of people to surround myself. And, it was through the fitness scene in New York City. And, I'd be lying to you if I didn't admit that I always had doubts about my capability and my potential athletically. And a lot of that was rooted in the messaging that I had as a child. I was constantly told, you can't, and you don't belong here, and you won't, and you shouldn't think about it, and you're too slow, so on and so forth. But I finally found the right group of people who didn't care, who just said, hey, just show up as you are, do what you can do, and you're accepted. It doesn't matter. And it was in this group that I started to see what I'm capable of, because some of these guys, played collegiately, some of them even, played pro and in different sports and in different arenas. And I started to see if I continue just showing up, I can kind of compete. I'm respectable. I'm not totally I'm not totally out of this, this range that can show up. And they ultimately got me to sign up for a couple small races, 5Ks, 10Ks. Eventually, they got me to sign up for my first half marathon. And I remember writing down a goal that year on a piece of paper saying, you're going to run your first half marathon. And, and I'm sure a lot of runners can relate to this. When you run your first half marathon, you're training up to 9, 10 miles. And then you get to race day and your body's not used to miles 11, 12, and 13. And then you need to summon everything you have in your soul to finish those last 3 miles. And I remember it like it was just yesterday, because that race that I ran for my first half marathon is a race now I've run for the last 10 years, almost every year. And it's funny, looking back on it and what that experience really did to kind of lay a cornerstone that at the time you don't really realize. You're learning a fundamental motion in the sport, and how that sport is way more than the physical. It's really about how you train your mind for those miles you never saw coming. And a couple years later, as I'm approaching my 30th birthday, that same group of people encouraged me to get into the world of triathlons. And I wasn't a good swimmer, but again, because they were incredibly positive, I trusted them, and I felt comfortable being vulnerable and putting myself in uncomfortable situations. And so craziest thing I'd done to that point in my life was I signed up for it. And for 6-7 months, I shut things down. I wasn't going out. I was training twice a day. People around me were getting concerned because it was really out of character for me to be doing what I was doing. Even though I got into the world of like endurance sports, like it was still like, wow, like he's not an Ironman. Like he wouldn't do that. And people kept asking me leading up to that race, why are you doing this? And quite frankly, I didn't have an answer for them. I didn't really know why I was doing it, but I felt incredibly compelled to just continue showing up and doing what I had to do to make it to race day. So I got to race day. It was June of 2017. It was 93 degrees outside that day. And I got into the swim, and it was half against the current, half with the current. I got out in respectable time, and then I transitioned to the bike. And for anyone listening who knows anything about bikes, it was the same weekend as the New York City bike tour. And the company that I rented the bike from sent me a hybrid instead of a road bike. And, the analogy that I give is it's like essentially ordering a Ferrari and getting a beat up minivan. So I'm like pounding away at this thing for 56 miles. And I'm just pounding. Everybody's just flying past me. And, those doubts are creeping in. And around mile 40, which is now the name of my podcast, I completely broke down. And there was salt all over my skin. I was completely dehydrated. I was in the middle of nowhere, Maryland. And, I finally started asking myself the same question everybody was asking me that whole time. It's, why are you doing this? Like, you paid money, you signed up, you gave up the last 6 months of your life. People kept telling you that this isn't you. Like, what compelled you to actually do this? And it was the first time that I kind of go into this fight or flight mode now, where I start to think about the younger version of myself that I'm pretty sure I was just hiding somewhere in my brain that I really didn't want to revisit, especially that was now almost 20 years later. And I started to think, if that kid navigated what he went through, that was a lot harder than finishing the last 30 miles of this race. And I started to think about, what I used to do back then to get through difficult situations and how I could, re-employ the same behavior here. And I remember my parents would always celebrate small wins as I was navigating treatment and different things throughout my childhood. And so when you're in that mode, you're immediately just looking for any way to claw yourself out. And I start thinking, okay, I have 30 miles to go, but if I break this down into 1 mile 30 times instead of 30 miles, and if I celebrate every single mile, it's a lot more digestible. And that's exactly what I did. So I broke it down, and I went from mile 40 to mile 41 to mile 42, all the way up till I got till the end of the race. And, people who saw me at the finish line were pretty terrified because I didn't look good, but I couldn't have been more empowered because I just realized like I could do just about anything. Like I quite frankly thought that was going to be the hardest thing I had ever done in my life. So I got back to New York after that. People thought I was done. I wasn't really going to, I was probably retiring at that point, but immediately I decided to sign up for my first marathon. And I always, especially in those last couple of years, I kind of looked at New York City Marathon as being this bucket list item. And I decided to sign up. And in order to get in, I had to raise money for charity. And I wrote down my story. I put it on a piece of paper before I typed it out. And I ended up shoving it in a drawer. And the reason I shoved it in a drawer was because as I was writing it, I got really self-conscious and I was worried that no one was going to donate and that this really powerful experience I just had at the Ironman was going to go to waste. All of a sudden I had all this momentum. I felt like I could do anything. And now I was starting to get, doubts and self-conscious and worried. And at the time I had a mentor who I trusted, and it took me a couple of weeks, but I finally summoned up the courage to approach him about it. And I showed it to him and I was like, hey, Tim, what do you think about this? And he looked at it and he laughed and he goes, why is your goal just $3,000? And I'm like, well, that's all I got to raise to get into the race. And he goes, you need to make your goal $100,000. And he gave me $1,000 and he said, go. And dude, that was one of the most impactful, if not the most impactful conversation I had ever had in my life. Because a lot of times in life, we hold out on releasing our potential because we anticipate someone mirroring it back upon us. And to that point in my life, despite the fact that I knew I had a lot of love from my family and my parents, I didn't ever hear someone tell me that they believed in me and they saw in me what I thought I had in myself. And he did, and it wasn't some sort of, crazy elaborate speech. It was just simply hey, you need to raise your goal because you're selling yourself short. And here's some action to show you how much I believe in you. And before I knew it, 1,000 turned into 5, 10, 20, 30,000. I got a call from NASDAQ. They got a hold of the story and they invited me to come ring the closing bell, which was another story because I had to sneak out of work at the time to go ring the closing bell at NASDAQ. ABC featured me during the broadcast in 2017. So now I went from almost never sharing this story to raising all this money to now literally being on the TV broadcast, running in a mic. And it was through that experience that I realized, A, the power of sharing your story, but B, how much hidden potential we all really have. And I got back to work after that, and I realized, I had been holding on to too much, and that I could no longer run away from what I felt was, my purpose at the time. And a year later, I was sitting at my desk and I Googled how to write a book. And that was when I wrote my first book. And it's really where the journey kicked off. So, that's where the running journey kicked off. But I know I've been talking for a little bit, so let me pause again.
I love when people go on these long stretches of talking through their story because I want to hear it and people want to hear it. So thank you for doing that. I mean, that really painted a beautiful, beautiful picture of everything you went through and the highs and lows along the way. And then, what you got from it. I have so many takeaways, and we could probably have hours long conversation on this. But I think one of the big things that stood out to me is that you underestimated the value and impact of your story because of your upbringing and how much you were told that you weren't going to be the person that you wanted to be. Right. And I think there's so many other people out there who probably are doing the same thing right now, where they don't believe they have much to offer or to give, or that they can hit some specific goal, whatever it is, whether it's running or something else in life. But the truth is, if you share that story, you actually hold yourself accountable to it, you might have just one person tell you the right thing, that one sentence that completely changes your perspective on yourself. I respect that a lot, as far as you continuing to open it up and then where you got. I think what was so cool about what you did was, at a young age, you put yourself in challenging environments to try to meet people, to try to feel a part of the community, which I think a lot of people, adversity wise, but also just overall the welcomeness side, that lacked at a young age, would shut down and kind of trap themselves in a corner until maybe they went out to college or something like that. But you kept pushing yourself. It kind of sounds like it would have been great if you ran track and field in high school. And I feel like track and field, for me, when I grew up, and for so many others, is such a great way to get that community sort of aspect. But I guess what advice do you have for someone from your end that might be growing up right now? They're listening to this podcast, they're in their first year of high school, they don't feel like they're connected with any sort of community. On those days when you're trying different things, you're putting yourself out there, but you just feel like you're kind of getting rejected and you're not clicking with the right group of people.
Yeah, look, it's all relative, right? And it goes back to, for me, it goes back to the fact that I had to grow up quick because of the circumstances that I was navigating. Yeah. So as a result of that, you start to see what real darkness is. Yes, being rejected sucks and it hurts and it's dark, but it's not as dark as some of the things that I had to navigate, with regards to cancer and the treatment and the bad news and the emotions of parents navigating it and figuring out, their lives as immigrants at the time. And so for me, it's, and I'm not even going to say it's crazy to say because it's true. At the end of the day, it ended up being a blessing that I had that perspective, despite the fact that it came under some really adverse circumstances. And so, that's why I tell people now, embrace the hard, like go into it. Like, because you don't realize that as hard as it may seem on the outside, when you come out on the other side, you're going to have an edge over everybody else. Right. And so that has, inadvertently helped me tremendously throughout everything, because, once you're that broken, no one can really impact you. Like, no one can touch you. Their words can't touch you. Their rejection can't touch you. The feeling of isolation can't touch you. Yeah, like it'll hurt, it'll sting, no doubt about it. But that's the thing, is it's really hard to break a person who's already been broken. And so, that's the mindset that I try to, I try to preach to other people is, yeah, it takes a little bit of trust, right? You don't know what you don't know. And you could hesitate to put yourself in difficult situations. But, I've never met anyone who's embraced discomfort and ultimately regretted it, because you grow, right? Like you grow, you learn about yourself probably more than you learn about, other things throughout that process. But once you have that extra bit of knowledge, like that is your advantage. And that can stretch well beyond, sport and relationships. It can go into your professional life as well, right? Like, speak up in those meetings and raise your hand and what's the worst that can happen? The customer says no. Like, like what's the worst that could actually happen? You got to shoot your shot. But I do understand that not everyone is wired to just walk into difficulty. But I can tell you, from lived experience, that it's never steered me wrong.
It's like a blessing and a curse, obviously, what you dealt with. But some people don't have like that level of adversity at a younger age that you had to go through. So I think like just you sharing like the stories, I think is like helpful for someone to reflect of like what it could have been, and like, hey, maybe I didn't go through those things, but like I have had like a competitive advantage through my life. I need to take advantage of this while I have it, because you never know how life can turn.
So I think if I may add one thing, I mean, for those people, look, I understand not everyone is going to have to navigate something like cancer, but, on a smaller level, sign up for that race. Like, it's the same idea in theory. It's essentially me signing up for that half Ironman. At the time, I had no idea what I was walking into, right? And that half Ironman could be someone's first half marathon. It could be someone's first marathon, whatever it is. Sign up for that race. Put yourself in a situation where you have to get uncomfortable. And to be honest, and I think you'll agree with me, the discomfort isn't actually on race day. The discomfort is the 4 months leading up to race day. So for 4 months, your mind is grinding. You're getting worried and concerned that you're not ready. You're battling the anxiety. You're wondering if you did enough. You're perhaps a little self-conscious about what's going to happen on race day. You're thinking about everything that can go wrong. And, quite frankly, you're putting your body through the pain of training and building and suffering through the volume. On a smaller scale, that is essentially, the best way in practice to put yourself in a situation where you can learn about yourself. And, that I think is part of the reason why over the last 8 years, I've continued to show up, because once you experience it once, it becomes a little addicting, because you start to realize like, wow, like I just grew exponentially. And if I can continue to grow exponentially, like, why not? And so, yeah, that's part of the process.
Yeah. And you gave some really good training advice through actually sharing like your story from that half Ironman about how you got to the point in the race where you were dehydrated, you didn't know if you could keep going. And then you played a game of mental gymnastics of just looking at it 1 mile at a time and celebrating those small wins. It's such a great piece of advice that I like to tell people who struggle from the mental sort of fatigue you get throughout a long run, for example. Just during the training, during that 4-month period you talked about, where that's really the hard part from your perspective. Because I think, again, the hard part is often going through that training cycle and the difficult speed workouts someone might be doing, or those long runs, balancing life as well. Is there like a top strategy that you like to deploy for yourself?
One thing I'll point out really quick before I answer that question is when you think about ultra marathoners, right? Ultra marathoners, let's say out there run a 50-mile race, 100-mile race, they'll tell you, like, they're not thinking about the distance as 50 miles or 100 miles. They're just thinking about where's the next aid station. And it's the same exact idea in, a smaller scale race where, like, if you can break it down into those more digestible goals, it all becomes a lot more realistic. And so to answer your question about training and how I think about it and some tricks of the trade, there's two pieces of this. And I think they're both kind of rooted in the word communication. So in the situation where, let's say, you're married, or you have a partner, or your schedule is demanding, are you communicating with those around you so that way they know what your priorities are, right? Because that's something that, quite frankly, I get a lot of people hitting me up. I get a lot of guys hitting me up being like, hey, how do I explain to my wife that I need to, head out and just be gone for, 3 hours on a Saturday, with the kids and so on and so forth. And I had to navigate it myself early on, in my own marriage, and kind of like, just be upfront with my wife and be like, look, like, you have my full commitment as a husband, as a father, but, in order for me to show up, as my best self, this is something that's important to me. And so there's that element to it. But at the same time, let's say you don't have that situation. A lot of it has to do with how you communicate with yourself. What are you ingesting? Like, what kind of material are you taking in order to prepare yourself mentally? Because the sport is just so mental. As much as, you want to think it's about being in shape and it's about logging the miles and it's about, doing the strength work, it is a lot of time alone. And is your mind ready to handle all that time, by yourself? And, one of the things I was thinking about earlier as you were speaking, and something that we talk about all the time in this sport, is as much as it's an individual sport, it really depends on the environment that you put yourself in. Are you surrounding yourself with the right people? Are you surrounding yourself with the right content? Right. And, is that content and that environment fueling you on this quote unquote individual journey? And so that's a big piece of it too. And when I think back to the Ironman day before I was, really involved more so in the marathon circuit, what fueled me was the fact that I just had the right people around me. Like, my entire life, I never thought I could do any of the things that I was doing, but I just had people telling me that I could. And that was really all that I needed, was someone who told me that I could. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Communication, regardless of your circumstances.
The more people that know about your story, I mean, like, that's a big reason, like, I wanted to create a, running social media page to, like, have people aware of what I'm doing. And then you have supporters and people handing you advice and keeping you accountable. Right. And I think that's all been super helpful. So I appreciate you sharing that. But I guess I would love to continue, on the path of your story. So New York City Marathon, you obviously heavily exceeded the fundraising goal. How was that first New York City Marathon for you?
That one was brutal because it's kind of similar to that first half marathon, right? I trained up to mile 20, and then mile 20 to 26 was brutal during that race. And there was a lot going on emotionally during that race because it was a really short period of time from when I signed up to when all of a sudden the fundraising went kind of crazy and I was getting, this unexpected attention. And I didn't know what I didn't know about my first marathon, quite frankly. Yeah. And it was painful, the last 6 miles. And I finished it, I think, in 4:40 or something like that. And at the time, I didn't really know what to make of that. I was just happy that I finished it. I remember the feeling of the shower right after that race and like how nice the warm water felt after that race. And like, I was supposed to throw a big after party and I could barely stand, and I slept like a baby that night. And where the story went from there was, like I said, I kind of realized something was happening in my life. I had to make some changes. Like I had to really focus my attention to seeing this purpose through. I wanted more fulfillment. And so I put pen to paper on Break Barriers, which is the name of my first book. And again, no literary background, Googled how to write it. And that next year in 2018, I didn't sign up for New York again, but I signed up for the Marine Corps Marathon. People had recommended it was a flat course. And side story, I don't want to sidestep on this too much, but my wife and I dated 3 times. We were dating for the second time at the time. And she came down to DC with me, and I ran the Marine Corps. It was a good experience, but I didn't think too much of it. But I believe the race is in October. And that year, she lived in Brooklyn. And the New York City Marathon that year, I think it was right around mile 8 or 9. I told her I'm going to go downstairs and I'm going to take a peek at the marathon. And I remember going down there, and I remember just feeling the buzz, feeling the energy. And at that point, I still was not comfortable calling myself a runner. Like, I definitely wouldn't tell people that I was a runner at that point in my life. But I remember just kind of making this promise to myself while I was out there that I was never going to miss that race again, because you start just by, and this just by seeing any marathon, but in particular, I want to call out New York, because you see some things in New York that you just don't see in other places. Yeah. And you really start to see the power of humanity, and you see some of these people who you could tell are out there on the course doing things that they never thought they were going to be able to do. And you see them, putting one foot in front of the other and using the energy of the crowd to lift themselves forward and propel themselves forward. And I had made myself that promise that I was never going to miss the New York City Marathon again. So I, signed up the following year. And what ended up happening shortly thereafter was someone had reached out to me, told me that they had access to a Boston bib for like $5,000, which if anyone's, trying to run Boston, they know that most bibs for charity purposes are at least $10,000. So I thought it was, digestible, and I kind of took them up on it. And as someone who never thought he was going to run New York, there I was running Boston. And I after I ran Boston, I think that was my 4th or 5th marathon at the time. I finally felt comfortable saying I was a runner. It took me 4 or 5 marathons to finally admit that I was a runner, and signed up for Chicago. And, I remember running like a 350. So I had already shaved off 50 minutes from my first race at that point. And someone had mentioned something about running the majors, and I just kind of threw my hat in the ring for Berlin, and then got into Berlin, and people say, hey, you're never going to get into London. It's the hardest race to get into. And I got into London, and I ran a 3:28 in London.
Wow.
So yeah. So now all of a sudden I started to see all right, I went from 4:40 to 3:28. I shaved off, well over an hour from my first race. Granted, it's been a couple of years, and I was starting to get more and more committed to it. It was brought to my attention that there was only one other 6-star Egyptian finisher. And because I was born in Egypt, I can technically qualify as an Egyptian finisher. And so I was like, it's kind of crazy, but let's do it. And signed up. I got into Tokyo and ran Tokyo, and then they added Sydney. And I actually connected with the other 6-star finisher. And for the record, he's wildly fast. I mean, he's running 240 marathons. And he told me that he had no plans to run Sydney. So I was like, all right, I'm going to take the title then. And so just ran Sydney this last year. Yeah. But I gave him a fair shot. It could have been his.
Wow. That's super cool. I mean, not every day you meet the first Egyptian world major completion individual. I don't even know that sentence.
Yeah, I don't know how to state it either, but it's cool to say, but I don't know how to word it. But I the first world major finisher. But yeah, no, it's crazy. But I don't look back on it as a personal accomplishment. I really don't. Now that it's done, like everything that I've realized over the last 8 years, and I preach this religiously. I know you follow me on LinkedIn. Finish lines are so fleeting. The moment you cross a finish line, it's great. There's a moment of relief. You realize you did something, and it feels good. But you have to acknowledge it's just that 30 seconds, that 1 minute. And what's more important is that you realize how far you've come from where you started. And in my case, as much as I acknowledge, the huge traction I saw from running 440, now running 320 in Sydney, and how impressive that may be to some people. What I really care about is, the person who thinks they can't run a marathon, or the person who hesitates to sign up for their first 5K, or the person who thinks their life, is really falling apart and they're going through X, Y, and Z, and, their circumstances couldn't be worse and they're never going to make anything of themselves. And I just want them to know, like, it's going to be okay. Like, you can do this. No one in the world, including myself, thought I was ever going to do something like this. And as grateful as I am for being able to say that I did it, I'm more grateful for the lessons I learned along the way. I'm not saying I would trade in those medals because they're nice to have, but if I had to choose between the medals and the title versus the lessons, I'd, 1,000 out of 1,000 times, I'd keep the lessons.
You've obviously built this resume for yourself of stories, learnings, medals, all of that you shared. And your accomplishments as far as your personal records are super impressive. Someone who's like thinking of getting into the sport, who's had a hard time committing, they don't want to put themselves out there and sign up for that big race, sell them. Like, what has the sport done for you? How has it improved your life? They hear the stories, it sounds great, but it's like, what's in it for them?
What are you avoiding about yourself? Because the true essence of this sport, because you spend so much time alone, is not necessarily, in my opinion, in the physical results.
Yeah.
But it's truly in what you learn about yourself, and not just your potential, as much as that is a huge, part of this process. You learn how fast you can be, you learn how strong you can be, learn how you can compete. But you also just learn about who you are as a human, your resilience, your grit, your ability to be disciplined, your ability to show up. And all those traits make you a better person all around outside the sport. And so if you feel like, there are areas of your life that can be improved, I think that's one of the things that running can do, is it can take you beyond the mile markers. It can take you beyond the finish lines and the medals, but it forces you essentially to spend time with yourself, which I feel like a lot of us avoid doing. And so that's, I think, one of the greater gifts this sport has, given me. And I think if you listen to a lot of entrepreneurs who have ventured into the sport, or who have run these races, a lot of them will tell you that they make most of their most important decisions on runs. And while I'm not a founder of a big company or anything like that, reading into that, it actually helped me, because anytime I need to make a critical decision, whether it's for, something I'm doing from a business side, or even something I'm doing from a personal side, a family decision of sorts, I go on a run and I let my mind kind of wander and let my mind, make sense of the decision-making process. And so philosophically, it's not just about the health benefits. It's about, the mental health benefits as well.
Spend a lot of time with yourself. I think sometimes people don't have an opportunity as they get older to like get to know themselves, get to think for themselves. Whenever I go on that run, it's always like the perfect time to slow down, no pun intended,
yeah.
But and actually be able to think for myself. I guess I'm curious for you, because I think we see this sometimes in the running space. And I just think this would be a really interesting question to ask you. Has there ever been a time where you felt like you took the sport too serious, where you overdid it?
That's an interesting question and interesting timing, because I actually just posted this morning about how I'm running New York in 3 weeks. It's my 7th New York City marathon now. And for the first time ever, I'm not putting any pressure on myself. I just ran my fastest marathon in Sydney. I'm waiting to see if they announce if Cape Town's going to be added as a major. And so, I'm kind of allowing myself to just be during this training cycle. I'm sure on race day, I'm going to get out there, I'm going to feel the adrenaline and I'm going to push myself, but I'm allowing myself to kind of just be right now. And this is new for me, because especially over the last 4 or 5 world majors, like I was pushing myself to see. Like, I remember it took me 4 or 5 races to break the 4-hour mark. And then once I broke it, I didn't know how far I could go. And then once I ran that 3:28 in London, I was like, what just happened? Like I can run sub 3:30. And then, I hired a coach, and I've been working with a coach now for a couple of years. And, I was running on a 3:15 track for most of Sydney. So like now I'm like in the back of my mind, I was just talking to someone yesterday. I'm like, can I run a sub 3 one day? Like what is and you start to really kind of think about it. And look, the gap between 3:20 and 3, in my opinion, is a lot harder than the gap I already bridged from 4:40 to 3:20. Because, those final 20 minutes to get below sub 3, I think it's about really perfecting the motion and really there's little room for error, if you're tracking down a sub 3 race. But throughout all that, I've kind of learned to not put so much pressure on myself, because I have to appreciate how far I've come thus far. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm like everybody else. I see some other runners out there and I'm like, I want to chase them. But at the same time, like everything in life, you got to start with gratitude. You just got to be grateful for how far you've come and lead with gratitude and allow the rest to play out.
That comparison game, I mean, it affects everyone in different levels or at different points. But I think just going back to gratitude always and looking at where you've came, like, I feel like you can never be someone to be overly hard on yourself, because the fact that you've even done what you've done, you defeated the odds so many times, right? And who knows where you'll end up a year from now, multiple years from now, but leading with gratitude of your experience, I know is probably something you're going to continue to do, and it's just going to help you. And I think others should certainly look to that when they're being hard on themselves naturally. Well, before we let people know how to find you and go over like some of the resources you have out there that you can offer, I guess like final tip that you want to just share for people out there, whether it's someone who's just looking to get into running the first time or just has like a hard time staying consistent. Is there any like final words for someone like that?
Yeah. One of the biggest learnings that I learned along the way, again, probably right around that same time after Boston, that 4th, 5th marathon. And what really helped me kind of get closer to these more competitive paces was the understanding that in order to run fast, you have to train slow. And, as someone who's been running a long time, I know this, but it's really counterintuitive for a lot of people who are getting into the sport, because the assumption is I got to run my fastest. And the truth of the matter is, for long distance running, that's not how you end up getting the best results. How you end up getting best results is training slow. And so once I allowed myself to believe the process and I committed to that, and I didn't push myself on my long runs, and I stuck to the training regimen, I started to see the results. And, I think that parallels beyond the sport, right? Like train slow and race fast. And, I think if you think about it, right, and if you slow down, other areas of your life and you allow yourself to kind of have those moments where you face yourself, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about communicating with yourself. You allow yourself to have those moments where you look within and, you get to know the person on the inside. Your potential goes, again, well beyond the course. And so that's, I think, the most important lesson that I've learned throughout all this. I tell a story about how before I met that group in my 20s and like I just wanted to kind of like keep up with my fitness, I went out for a run with my roommate at the time who he did cross country and track in high school, and he was really fast, and he got an offer to run in college, so on and so forth. And I had no idea what I was doing. And we were in the city somewhere down in the financial district, and I would sprint, stop, and he'd be like, dude, what are you doing? And I'm like, oh, I'm just out here for a run. And he was like, listen, in the sport of long distance running, it doesn't matter how slow you go. Just put one foot in front of the other. I don't care if you tiptoe. He goes, Just don't stop. And that lesson, now looking back on it nearly, 15, 20 years later, you realize that can be applied to anything in life, anything that you want to accomplish in life. It doesn't matter how slow you go, just don't stop. And so those two things, I think, kind of go in parallel.
Don't stop. I love that. I think that, that can be applied to so many areas, because sometimes you just got to slow down, and
it's okay,
whatever it is. But if you stop, like, you lose any of the momentum you have.
He's like, it's okay, go slow. Like, no one's gonna, and that's the same thing for anyone, again, who's looking to sign up for their first race. Train slow, race fast.
Yeah. Love that. This has been a phenomenal episode. I super appreciate the time. I mean, just so many takeaways. There was emotion here. There was real stories that I think are relatable, and a ton of great advice. Want to give you the opportunity to share, one, where people can find you. I know you have 2 books. I know that you have a life coaching service that you offer up as well. Feel free to give out all that information. I know that
I appreciate that.
I want to give them the opportunity to connect with you.
You got it. Everything can be found on my website, www.bishoytadros.com. The books are available also on Amazon. My podcast, Mile 40, is available on all major podcast platforms. And if you have any questions or want to reach out personally, I'm most active on both Instagram and LinkedIn. So Bishoy Tadros, really, on both. If you look it up, you can find me.
Great. Thank you, Bishoy, and thank you, everyone, for listening to another episode in the Run Breiter podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, just appreciate if you give us a good review. And if anyone needs any specific running tips or advice or running coaching, feel free to reach out to me at any point. And as always, don't forget to run brighter. Talk to you soon.